I'm Jonathan Melhuish. I'm going to talk to you about my undergraduate research project, which looked at how online social networking platforms such as Facebook support relationships, and also contrasted the way these platforms work with an understanding of relationships taken from social psychology. So our story starts 2 years ago in Gdańsk in northern Poland, where I moved for a gap year. Some would say it's a slightly crazy move because I didn't speak a word of the language, I didn't know anyone who was there. But even worse, it meant leaving behind all my friends who were back in Birmingham. But I'm pleased to say that Facebook really helped me to feel close to those friends, even though we're physically, obviously, very different. And made things a lot easier when I came back to kind of not feel that our lives had separated too much. There weren't any kind of uneasy silences of feeling like we weren't friends. Those social bonds had been preserved via, thanks largely to online social networking platforms. I'm sure that's a story that's familiar to lots of you. But the big problem is really that consuming news from all your friends, my study showed that the average user had 212 friends on Facebook. And consuming news from all those friends, when you consider that on average they publish about one story a day, can be very, very time consuming. So let's look at what Facebook does to help users to deal with this quantity of news. Some of the names have been blacked out to protect the innocent, but basically all it does is, or appears to do, is to give you a small random selection of these friends' stories. Obviously, there's not 212 there. It just takes some kind of random selection for you. But hang on a minute, buried in that mass of social information, there could be some really interesting and important stories there that we wouldn't want to miss. So is just taking a small random selection and putting that in a chronologically ordered list, is that really the best we can do? Shouldn't we be thinking about how we could better design an interface to help users find news that's interesting to them? And I don't know about you, but I sometimes get these dreams where I'm meeting lots of different people, and it sort of makes sense at the time that everyone knows each other. But when you think back on it, I'm getting some nods. When you think back on it, you realise that lots of those friends you met at different times in your life, completely different social contexts. In fact, there's no way they can know each other. The only real common link is you. Well, Facebook works exactly like that dream. The newsfeed is exactly like that dream. It just throws everyone in together with no representation of social context. So how can we look at actually displaying this social news within its social context? Well, I guess the easiest way to technically implement would be to get to users to manually classify their friends. And so that's something that I tested in my study. But people really struggled with this task. I guess it just showed that putting your friends in boxes can be very time-consuming and emotionally taxing for people. So maybe that's not the answer, but maybe some of you are familiar with things like this. This is the friend wheel, where it shows the relationships between your friends by lines across the circle. Or with the touch graph, which does the same kind of thing, but tries to lay out your friends according to the friendships that they share in common. What you land up with is quite a meaningful map of your social graph. So you've got one of my friends at the centre, and this is a university society that he's a member of, and this is some of his colleagues, for instance. Another idea, I mean, my background is in artificial intelligence, and so I immediately thought, well, maybe we can get a computer to learn and predict which news stories are interesting. And if you're not familiar with machine learning techniques, then don't worry about the stuff in the middle. But the important thing here is that we need some examples of what news is interesting. We can do some kind of statistical wizardry and predict what other news stories might be interesting. So Facebook does this already. I don't know how many of you have actually discovered these buttons. my study showed that over 3/4 of people have never used this feedback, and of those that have used it, nobody believed that it had any difference. Now, perhaps the reason for both of those is that the mechanism by which these stories are being selected, don't forget, is completely opaque. It appears like a random selection. So as soon as you give people control over that mechanism, they're not really sure what these buttons are going to do and whether they're actually having any effect. But I'd argue that there's always opportunities for collecting observed feedback, observing user data, user behavior, in order to train a machine learning system. So here you see an example of an interaction where the user has implicitly stated interest in a specific person by hovering over them, and then stated interest in a particular story type by clicking on that icon to view the story. So by designing the interface in that way, we can increase the amount of training data that we get for our automatic predictor system. So bringing these two ideas together of social context and machine learning, I created a digital prototype in which the most interesting users, according to the machine learning, are in the innermost circles, and the angle around the circle represents the social context of those people. So that's about it. Let's just recap those main points. So I argue that the average user is already incapable of consuming all the news from all their Facebook friends. I suggest that laying news out in its social context can help users to find news that's interesting to them. To give a quick example of this, actually, it may be that, say, your old school friends, you're only really interested in major events in their lives, whereas the people that you see day to day, maybe your colleagues or local friends, you might be very interested in events that they're attending, that kind of thing. And that's a really simple example, and that relationship might be quite complex and dynamic. But I suggest that laying it out in that way could be a sensible way of presenting this information. And I suggest that machine learning can also help to prioritise information within the interface automatically. So thanks for your time.
Thank you very much.